Damn it! I'm sick and tired of you and this family. Would you believe I once said that to my wife? A lot of people would not believe it. Many Catholics have anger issues, pent up anger that eventually explodes into horrific verbal and sometimes physical abuse. Today, we're going to talk about anger, its effect on the home, work, and a person's spiritual life, what causes anger, determining if anger is justified or not, and how to overcome anger through the practical lessons of the Catholic Church. Hello everyone, today's episode is about anger and ways to identify and suggestions on how to overcome anger based on my own experience. No psychology lessons, only good old practical Catholic lessons.
Welcome to another episode of Practical Catholic with David Cease. Practical Catholic is a spiritual coaching show to help you find peace, love, and joy in family and work life. We are here each and every week to help you grow spiritually, to become successful in this life, and to be a saint for the life after.
My story begins when I was in 8th grade and when I was in high school. These were two times where I can remember getting so angry at someone. The first was I was angry at a boy. I was in 8th grade, and my close friend and I, we went to this dance. In those days they had these clubs that you could go dancing. They were for young kids, so they weren't no alcohol or anything like that. It was just, tween-age kids, like kids from 13 to about 16 before high school or freshman at least. And we were there, and my friend was always picked on for some odd reason. He just had this big thing that said, pick on me, I guess. And so he was being picked on by a group of kids that I knew because they were actually in our Catholic school. And they were picking on him and constantly doing this. And I remember just ignoring it. And they weren't picking on me. They were just picking on my friend. And they kept doing it over and over and over again until we were leaving the dance. And my father was right there. And they said something to my friend that I just remember getting extremely, extremely angry. And you got to understand, growing up, I started becoming an anti-bully. So anytime someone was bullied, I would get very angry about that. I just couldn't stand it because I once was bullied myself in about 5th grade. So I got so angry. And I remember looking at my dad and saying, Dad, I got to beat this kid up. And my dad, instead of saying no, he basically said, okay. And so I walked over to the kid and I grabbed him, and I threw him to the ground. He got back up, and I got him into this big headlock. And I guess my father finally realized that maybe we shouldn't be fighting in the parking lot of this, dance club. And I remember I was so angry. I had almost like this supernatural strength. This kid was about 3 inches taller than me, probably weighed, 180 pounds. And I only weighed about, at that time, probably 140. And so I remember getting him in a headlock, and I wrestled. I wrestled for about 4 years by this time. So I knew a lot of good moves. And I remember being so angry and powerful that I picked up this kid, and my father jumped on this kid. Now, my father's 6 feet tall, and at that time probably weighed about maybe 230, 240. So I've got about almost 400 pounds, and I'm lifting. And I remember my father got lifted up, and I got lifted up, and I just got so angry. And finally, the fight stopped, and the kid kind of was crying back, into the dance club. But I remember being very, very angry at the situation. And my father never yelled at me. He just kind of said, we just drove home, we dropped off our friend, and that was the story. We never talked about it. End of story. But I think deep down inside, my father realized that I was, in a sense, defending an innocent person. My friend, he was this meek and mild person that just allowed everyone to pick on him. And I had to have enough was enough. And that's why I got angry and I wind up defending, my friend. The second time I got angry, and this is a very memorial time, was when I got angry at my father. Now, prior to this moment, I don't think I've ever got angry because unless it was because of a situation where someone was picking on someone, or they were getting bullied, or they were trying to pick on me or something like that. But in this case, I was coming out of wrestling practice. I was extremely tired. And my father started asking me a couple of questions, like, how did wrestling practice go? Blah, blah, how did you do? And all this other stuff. And I remember just yelling and screaming at him hysterically, and just yelling at him, why do you have to ask these questions? Can't you believe me alone? And just going, it was almost like an out-of-body experience, just yelling at my father. And my father kind of just quieted, and he just said, oh, I just really wanted to know how the day went. And then we drove home, and that was it. Now, I mentioned that one because in that anger, it was very mean, okay? My father never did anything to provoke that anger. In fact, he was a very patient man, and it was really unjustifiable. It was wrong. It was completely wrong. But I lashed out at him because of the emotions of anger, frustration, tiredness. And, that's what happened. And it just kind of came out, and it was this uncontrollable behavior. And I remember it to this day. I mean, that's almost like probably over 30 years ago, maybe even 35 years ago. And I did that. I remember that because, my father's a great man, and he did not deserve that. And I don't know what ever transpired. But from that moment on, something really changed in me, that I used anger a lot. Anger became in some sense, a mode of operandi. It really helped me. I shouldn't say helped me. It really, got me through. And a lot of times for wrong reasons. Of sports, I got angry. I realized anger almost had a power in itself. When I was in the Marines, it even exasperated it even more. I tell people, the Marine Corps is nothing but controlled anger, that they can unleash, and I'm suspecting that even in combat, it's probably a controlled anger. This is anger. And then when I had kids, it was not a pretty sight. And a lot of times, especially at the early age of having kids and being married, there was this contention with my anger and everything that came on. I would, you want to talk about road rage, I would have road rage that was so severe that literally I would be thinking, if someone cut me off the line, I would think about how I could, basically torture this guy. Anger, that's what it is. And as Catholics, I see this a lot amongst a lot of Catholics, an anger that is out there that is almost all-consuming and really bad. Even good Catholics getting really angry. So today we're going to talk about anger, and we're going to talk about, its effects on family, on life, where it comes from, and as well as how to overcome it, because it is overcomeable. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't get angry. In fact, angry is okay, but there's a lot to it than just saying anger is an emotion, So the first thing I want to, just briefly talk about is that anger is something that doesn't just, someone is not just born with an anger issue. At least I don't think that's the case at all. But we can train ourselves, characteristically, that, to be angry and not being able to control our anger, and most importantly, not only just to control their anger, but actually harness the power of anger for good deeds, for loving deeds, and also being able to be taught what I would call meek and mild. Jesus was meek and mild. Now, meek and mild does not mean that we should be a doormat. Now, I want to emphasize that. Meek and mild does not mean we are a doormat, okay? Meek and mild means that we know and we willingly sacrifice our, righteous anger to allow some greater good, like Jesus. Jesus was meek and mild when he went to the cross. But that doesn't mean that he was a doormat. That's what we understand. We have to understand that, Jesus was not a doormat. Just because he was crucified and he was tortured and, eventually killed on the cross, didn't mean he was a doormat. He chose to be meek and mild at that moment to show to the world what really is. Love is about being meek and mild when the world is angry at you. And that's what they were. I look at my example, my father, when I yelled at him, and his meekness and his love when he was yelling and screaming, when I was yelling and screaming at him, showed how much he loved me. And that wasn't the only time I yelled at him. I can remember when I enlisted in the Marines, or I wanted to enlist, I did actually eventually do that, but before I wanted to do it, he tried to convince me not to join the Marines, and I wanted to join the Marines, and I was yelling and screaming at him why he couldn't understand why he didn't want me to enlist in the Marines. And, and again, he was meek and mild at that point, and I said some terrible things. Me being adopted, I said to him, that I never considered him my father, and I don't, all these mean things, which of course I always considered him my father. I always loved him as a father. But as a young teenage kid, you're always thinking, what can I say that can, rile him up and make him angry? But he didn't get riled up. He was meek and mild. I know if my father had responded back angrily at me, it would have just been a constant battle between two angry men. But he wasn't. He was meek and mild. So that when I grew up, I realized what a beautiful man he really was, or is, I should say, he's still alive. What a beautiful man he is. So being meek and mild doesn't mean that you're a doormat. You're exchanging your justifiable anger to love. And love wants the good of the other person and realizes that at that moment in time, the one who is angry really doesn't know what he or she is doing. In my case, I really didn't know what I was doing. I was just this selfish little boy that had to prove my case to my father, this young, child of a teenager. So we have to understand that, right? So what does anger really do to people? Okay. I talked about how, anger can destroy people. I'm going to tell you one thing. I've been running this business, and I have a business here, pretty successful. But I will say that when I had my anger issues, I lost in my business a $750,000 deal because of my anger. Imagine that. We had close to about $1 million deal. We got paid on to about $250,000 of it, and we still had about $750,000 still left to continue on the project. But the vice president who was in charge of this project, him and I never got along. And there were a lot of times where I just got angry and started yelling at him. Can you imagine that? I was yelling at my customer, which, eventually he said, all right, we're ending this project. Done. And we lost the $750,000 deal in our hands. And that's what happened to anger management, right? And it doesn't look good when you're yelling and screaming. But conversely, I have won many customers' hearts over by being meek and mild. I know in other episodes I have explained that after I overcame my anger management issue, it flares up every once in a while, but in most cases I'm pretty gentle and meek. It really, I've said this in other podcasts that I had a customer where he had anger management issues, where he would just yell and scream at me. And, this one time he we had done something by accident, and he was yelling and screaming for at least 10 minutes at me. And then after he yelled, I looked at him and I said, okay, so how are we going to fix this now? Let's see. This is what we're going to do. And he looked at me and he realized that his anger and his rage really wasn't solving the problem. And after 5 minutes, he said to me, Dave, I'm really sorry for yelling at you. And I looked at him and I just said, it's okay. I understand. That's what meek and mild does. Okay? You can win customers over because of your meek and mildness behavior. But more importantly, I've now known this person for years. He's been my best customer, my best advocate for me. And eventually, hopefully, he'll be a better Christian for that. And he has told me. So, meek and mildness, influencing in the business, success of your business. Okay? You can win people's hearts over, not just to win them for Christ, but also, first, it all begins with winning them over for your business. It really does. And when they have their confidence, then they'll have confidence in their spiritual life. When I had my anger issues, I wasn't the nicest husband and father, right? There's lots of, bad things I used to say, to my wife or get angry. I was almost like a spoiled little kid, with her, with the little temper tantrums and everything else. But we do, now it's better, right? We can communicate more effectively and better. And I'm not saying I don't get angry once in a while at my wife and stuff. I still do. It flares up every once in a while. How about as a father? More patient. Time to listen to them. Work with them. Those are the things that occurs. So more quality time rather than always angry and fearful of what the father's going to do. And that doesn't show an example of what a true father is, or God the Father is. So those are the things that we can do to destroy our business, our family life. And then it destroys our spiritual life. It destroys it in a sense that, a lot of times anger issues just eats away at people. They try to be nice. They try to be good. They try to be holy. They try to do all these things, thinking that that's going to make them, cover their conscience or do whatever. And of course, they explode and they become this, angry person. And eventually, after trying for maybe months or years or whatever, they just become angry and bitter for the rest of their lives. And we don't want that. Okay? That is not a good Christian, that is not a person who becomes holy and seeks the virtues. So, and anger can eat us away. So let's go to what the world's view of anger is in the church and what they differ and what they're kind of common about. All right. So the world's view of anger is that anger is an emotion, which the Catholic Church agrees. It is an emotion. It's part of the passions. And so it flares up. But the one thing the Catholic Church does know is that anger, because it's part of the passion, is the fuel. So if you listen to my podcast about the passions, I always, make the analogy that the passions are kind of like, your fuel, your engine to get things done. So if the intellect is kind of the brains, okay, of the operation, where it's thinking, giving out ideas and everything, and the will is the part that says I'm going to do this. Out of all the options that the brain is giving, the will says, I want to do this. It's the passions that actually says, that motivates the body or moves the body to do the actions that the will has chosen. So if for example, there's spaghetti and I really like spaghetti and that's my, I love it and I desire it and everything else, then, one of the passions is being, liking something, going after something that I like and love. Then what's going to happen is the brain is going to say, ooh, I can have spaghetti for dinner. I can have spaghetti and meatballs for dinner, or I can have this leftover, broccoli or this leftover cheesecake. all of a sudden my will is going to say, hey, I want that spaghetti and meatballs. And then the passion that says, oh, I love spaghetti and meatballs. It now motivates my body. It drives my body to make that spaghetti and meatballs. So the passions, these emotions, help us to act or motivate us to do certain things. And so anger is one of them. Anger is probably one of the greatest passions that does get things, that allows us to get things done. So anger is an emotion, but more than just emotion, it's the fuel to get things done. It actually will help us to get things done. And later I'm going to quote a nice quote from St. Augustine, but I will talk about that a little bit later. So we agree, okay? The second thing about anger, that the world's view of anger, remember this is the topic, that the world views anger as being evil. This is one of the worst things that can happen, because we have, in essence, this is an attack on manliness, I think, in some sense, because men tend to get angry more than women, in that emotion, so anger probably tends more to the male than to the female, and so we've almost made anger into this, like, if you raise your voice even 1 decibel above the normal, then you must be angry, and if you're angry, you're an evil man. And anger is not evil, okay? And we go back to the thing, which is anger is an emotion. Now, psychologists will tell you that, but what do I mean by anger is considered evil by the world? We have this distaste to anyone who is perceived to be angry. Look at Fox News or CNN or any of the news, and they will pit a diehard liberal with a diehard conservative, and they're yelling and screaming at each other. And the world, to make it look like it's some kind of charade or a game or that, these are people evil or dumb. So the world views anger as being dumb or evil or whatever. And yet anger isn't morally neutral, okay? It could be wrong, but it could also be right. There is righteous anger and there's unrighteous anger, okay? Now, okay, and so that's what happens. The next is that anger is managing what you do. So a lot of times the world views anger that it's okay to be angry, but it depends on how you vent it out. And, that is true, but it's part of the truth. But there's more to anger than just, how to vent your anger. There's a lot more to it in overcoming anger that is, A, unjustifiable, but B, in a way that can transform and make anger into a blossoming loving way, okay? So all they focus on is how to manage your anger. So it winds up being like, well, you can exercise, you can do a punching bag, you can, yell at the wall, these things, right? That just kind of helps you vent your anger, as opposed to really overcoming it, or not even just overcoming it, but transforming anger into love, into loving acts, okay? Loving acts. So those are the ways that the world kind of, really makes anger just this myopic way, okay? But there's a better way of view about anger. In the Catholic Church's view of anger is the same thing, which is anger is an emotion. It's part of our passions, and it motivates us. It really does. It's amazing how, if you look at most wars, okay, look at the propaganda in most wars, okay, even in the United States, what they would do is that they would try to make you, get angry. In World War I, there's a famous poster of a German soldier, standing up, and he's looking almost animalistic looking, and next to him is this woman It's a French woman, because the war was between the Germans and the French, or at least most of the war. And, and it's a French woman, and she's, her clothes are almost off of her, and she has, a little blood on her hands, and she's like, fainting and kind of like, wooing a little bit. And, and it says, protect this woman from the Huns, meaning Huns here is the Germans. It's supposed to give you the imagery of that he is raping and pillaging this woman to make you angry and to make you think that this is righteous, okay? Because, of course, the Catholic Church knows, that if you can prove that your anger is righteous, then you are morally right to be angry, even to the point of violence. Believe it or not, to protect a life. So, it's this idea that every war, everyone wants to say that we're on the right side. And so now your anger towards the enemy, because they're going to now have propaganda to dehumanize the enemy, in this case, the Huns, the Germans. It was the same way with Germany in World War II. You had the Nazis, the Krauts, and you had the Japanese, the Japs, and they dehumanized them to make them look like they're some kind of evil people, and then it make you realize that you're right and they're wrong. Now, in those cases, that was the truth. That was the way that it is. But the point, why are they doing that? Because they know that anger is a primary mover, right? Men aren't going to enlist in the military if they don't think it's right and if they're not angry about it. If they're just passive about it, then they're not going to join the military. But if you can get them all riled up and angry, well, then they will sign up. And then you add to that fact that they're on the right side, well, then they'll fight even harder. That's what the Nazi Germany's did. Every nation dehumanizes the others to make them look like they're the evil people. And you're right. Which leads to number 2. The Catholic Church says there is justifiable anger. There is righteous anger versus unrighteous anger. Now, I'd like to read you a Bible quote, right? This is the woes, all right, that I always like talking about. It says, Jesus is basically issuing out some woes. Woe to you, woe, Bethsaida, Chorazin, all these woes that are coming out. Now, I can almost venture to say that when Jesus was doing those woes, that he probably wasn't just going, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida. If mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago. No. I can only imagine that Jesus was saying, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if mighty works done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it shall be more tolerable on the day of judgment for Tyre and Sidon than for you. See that? I don't think so. And do you think when Jesus went to the temple and he kicked the money changers over and started making a whip out of a cord, do you think he was just like, oh, you make my house into a den of money changers? No. He was probably there angry, making a whip. And that was rightly so, because he was rightly justified. This is a house of prayer, of worship, not a marketplace. And he would have been angry, and he would have said it in a loud voice. But yet, because that is justifiable anger. And that's the prime mover that goes on with it. We have to understand that, if you ever see like Rocky movies or, I would probably say Rocky movies or some other like hero from, these hero movies where the hero is beaten down and then all of a sudden you see this sense of like anger because, let's say, the evil person, did something to the loved one of the hero. And now the hero gets all angry and he fights back and he gets that extra strength, right? You see that? That's what we're talking about, what anger can do. And in some ways, the cross represents that. The cross represents this anger that God has, Jesus has. For who? For Satan, for evil. That's where our anger lies. Evil and to Satan. There is this idea that we need to be angry at that, at sin, our sin, our sin and Satan, so that we will be having a prime mover and not allowing them to conquer us and not fall for the evil one and to change. Which leads to this beautiful quote from St. Augustine. St. Augustine said this. He said, "Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way they are." Now, I don't know what the context of what he means by anger at the way things are and courage. Does that mean, the things of the earth and the way they are, or spiritually? But you can take that and say we are to be angry at the way things are. This Friday, we are marching for life at D.C. The March for Life is going to occur this Friday. And why? Why are we doing that? So we are angry at the way things are. The killing of innocent children, the euthanasia, the disregard for human life, and then we need to have the courage to see that they do not remain the way they are, in a peaceful way, in a loving way, in a meek and mild way. This is how we convert anger to love. We convert anger to love by focusing on being meek and mild, but showing our courage to march in life. Even though there are going to be people who hate you and deride you, even when people are going to say how ridiculous you are and spit on you and make you feel like you're a nobody. That's just exactly like Jesus. Anger at the way things are, right? That's what happened. We should be affronted that people are, there's legislation going on that are anti-Catholic. But we should convert that anger to love, use that anger to motivate us to love and become meek and mild, and do what is right. Use courage to do what is right. Because it takes courage. Do you think it takes more courage to go to the cross, not defending yourself, and dying on the cross? Huh? And we glorify men who go into, battle or go into a ring and beat each other up to a pulp, all right? But it takes more courage knowing that I'm going to go into a ring and just get beat up. That takes more courage. It takes more courage to be meek and mild and walking down. I know it does. Trust me. It's easy to fight back. It's easy to defend, yourself. It is. I've done it many a times. But to stand there and to take ridicule and to get beat up and to allow, them to do all they want to you takes a lot more courage. That is why Our Lady has so much courage, because she had to see this, and she never defended herself, and she never defended her son. Never. She was quiet. And so, St. Augustine, hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are anger and courage. anger at the way things are, and courage to see that they do not remain the way they are. Are we angry at our own sins? Are we angry at our own, vices? If we are, then we'll have the courage to see that they do not remain the way they are. So there are so many things that we can do. So anger, there is a justifiable anger, right? And we're even justifiable of using violence to protect and defend. And I'm not trying to say there isn't. But in the Bible, St. Paul says there are a lot of things that are lawful, but not everything builds up. So just because it's lawful to take arms and to defend ourselves, we might not want to do that. And a great example of that is, I remember talking to a friend of mine, and we were commenting about two groups of people who fought to defend the Catholic Church. The first was the Cristero Wars, okay, Viva Cristo Rey. And the second one was the War of the Vendée, okay, the one that occurred in France, the War of the Vendée. And they were devout Catholics who fought for the Catholic Church. And the second one was in Mexico, the Cristero Wars. And, there were a couple of saints that were canonized on that, but most of them did not, all those saints were not canonized because they fought in those wars, but they did help out. But, if you look at the martyrs who were being, martyred in the turn of the century, if you look at all the martyrs that occurred in Rome, in all the countries like Japan and Korea, and all those countries, and Germany and everywhere else, they didn't fight back. They did not fight back. They were meek and mild in going to their martyrdom. That's what happened. Okay? Hope has two beautiful daughters. Their names are Anger and Courage. Anger because of the sin that occurs, and the courage to go to martyrdom. So, yes, we can use justifiable anger and justifiable violence to defend ourselves, but which is better? Martyrdom or fighting back? That's what I ask you. And as me, I would choose martyrdom. St. Maximilian Kolbe was given 2 crowns, and he had a vision of Our Lady, and Our Lady said, which 2 crowns would you want? The crown of martyrdom or the crown of virginity? And Maximilian Kolbe said, I want both. He wanted to be a martyr and a virgin, and that's what he was. He would eventually die in Auschwitz, giving up his life for another prisoner as a religious, which means he took a vow of celibacy or chastity. And so he did. He died both a martyr and a virgin. So it's better to choose the greater, which is martyrdom. And that is meek and mild, and that takes a lot more courage than fighting back. So let's talk about what do we do with that anger, okay? When we feel angry, we should first determine, is it justifiable or non-justifiable, right? It's easy just to unleash your anger because you feel that emotion, rather than looking at that emotion and trying to zoom out and say, is that justifiable or not? And I can almost guarantee everyone that probably 95% of the time is not justifiable. It's probably something else rooted in either some kind of resentment, attachment, frustration, something like that made us angry. Impatience, so it's probably not. And in those rare 5% that anger is justifiable, I would say that being meek and mild and merciful is better and more Christian-like than it is to unleash angry, yelling and screaming and all the other stuff that goes on. So it's important to understand that we have to first, is it justifiable or not? And if it is justifiable, I would lean towards meek and mildness, especially if you were always kind of angry, which I was. That's how it was. So how do we overcome anger? Okay. Now, these are the things I want to kind of explain how I came up with a couple of these ideas and what we're going to do here, because I was an angry person, you know. Even though I went through my conversion and I did our consecration, you know, we have this idea that grace is just going to magically make us patient and build virtue, right? We have this, oh, no, we have the sacraments, which means that we have the sacramental magic that occurs that makes us so patient and so holy and so virtuous. Oh, no, that is not the case. That is not the case at all. Grace is not magic, you know? The priest doesn't go up there and say, hocus pocus, and now you're going to be this great, magical, wonderful saint walking out church, you know? That's not what's going to happen, you know? In the, when we talk about confession, right? When he asks you to do an act of contrition, firm purpose of amendment. You know, you don't walk out of the confessional saying, wow, all of a sudden I have all this virtue. Firm purpose of amendment. That means that it is our responsibility to change who we are. It's not the magical grace, okay? Now, grace will help us. How does it help us? Grace allows us to meditate on our sins, to help us have a disdain for our sins, and for us to look at things in a spiritual way. Okay? I can tell you right now, grace helps out, not by doing it for you, by helping you recognizing, by helping you, figuring it out. Just like a coach. A coach doesn't, throw the ball for the quarterback. He teaches him. Or, the coach, guides the person, corrects the person. Grace is the same way. Grace guides and mentors us so that we can learn to overcome. A greatness of a father is not because he does it for his children. No. The greatness of a father is that he teaches and mentors so that the son or the daughter does it for himself. And when we get to heaven, when we accomplish some great things, the father can say, it was all you. It was all you. Even though you can say to the father, no, it was all you. That is the greatness of a father. A greatness of a teacher is not because the teacher does the homework for you. The greatness of the teacher is that he leads you so that you can do it for yourself, that you learn. That's the greatness. And yet we kind of think that if I just go to daily mass, if I do a rosary, if I do, go to confession, then all of a sudden, whammo, I'm going to be, virtuous, patient, kind, and gentle, loving, meekness, and everything else. And that is not the case. So we have to work on it. Grace perfects nature. It doesn't eliminate nature. So we have to work on it. So the first thing we do to overcome anger management, and this is what I had to do and I did, is the first thing is to have a daily examination of conscience. Daily examination of conscience. And I write it down. I write my examination of conscience every day. So what does that do? That helps me recognize that I have an issue. That's one, right? I have an anger management issue. If I constantly am saying, Jesus, I'm sorry for yelling at my wife, my children, maybe even hitting my children or whatever it is, then you have an anger issue, okay? Or, Lord Jesus, forgive me because I'm impatient. I was impatient with my mother, my wife, or whatever it was. So that's an issue, okay? So it helps us recognize that we have an issue. Also helps us recognize who we have an issue with. when we have an issue with, where do we have an issue with, okay? And, any alcoholics will tell you, AA will tell you that knowing is half the battle. It's when we don't do that, all right? The other thing the daily examination of conscience helps us do is it breaks our pride, right? I don't think we're going to do a daily examination of conscience and say, dear Lord, I am so perfect. I'm great. I do everything awesome. And, we're not like, hopefully, that tax collector that says, I am so perfect and great. But really, when we do our daily examination of conscience, we say, Lord, I am a sinner. Here's what my sins are. So the examination will tell you, recognize that you have an issue. Where is it occurring? When is it occurring? What are the patterns that occur? I'll tell you this one example. I was writing my daily examination of conscience, and for a while I was doing pretty well with my anger issues, and I was doing really well. And all of a sudden, for about, I would say about 6 to 7 weeks, I was getting really, really bad. I mean, so bad. It was bad. And, yelling at my kids, my wife, and just, almost lashing out at them. And I was like, whoa, what's going on with me? And so because I wrote everything down on my examination of conscience, I pinpointed exactly when this occurred. And then I sat down and I said, what happened 6 weeks ago, or 6 or 7 weeks ago, that would make me do this? You know what I realized? I was taking a drug, off-the-counter drug, for allergies. I think it was Zyrtec, I think it was at the time. I was taking Zyrtec. And Zyrtec, I all of a sudden stopped taking Zyrtec, and I went back to normal again. And I was like, wow. So I Googled and researched Zyrtec, and there's a 2%, I think it was like 1 or 2% of people who take Zyrtec become mildly violent. And I'm like, what does that mean, mildly violent? And the reason why they don't say this in the drugs, and you have to Google this, is because I guess pharmacies don't have to tell you what the effects are if it's like less than like 5% or something like that. And so I realized that, and I said, oh my goodness, I didn't know Zyrtec could cause me. And it was weird because the Zyrtec was making me feel like I had like low inhibitions. Like I was like, when if someone takes a lot of alcohol, their inhibitions come down and they really don't stop what they're doing. That's why people go crazy if you drink too much. So it was like that. So it was like unleashed anger, and I couldn't control it because there was a chemical that was preventing me from doing it. That's what an examination of conscience does, especially if you write it down. Okay? So write your examination of conscience down. Okay? So the next thing you want to do is, where is it coming from? Now, I'm going to give you some ideas of where anger comes from. The number one, and probably the most deadly of them all, comes from resentment. And I call that is probably the most deadliest anger that it comes from. Resentment is when you resent certain things. You might resent a person. You might resent, your life. Okay. I had this one employee, and her husband physically abused her and physically abused her children. I mean, seriously, really bad and consistently. And when you talk to him, it felt like he resented the world. Like the whole world owed him everything. So that's the worst thing, resentment. The next is attachment. Okay, 95% of probably our anger comes from attachment or an inordinate love of something. Maybe ideas, tools, letting go of the past, goals, careers. Okay, these attachments. One of my attachments were ideas. When someone didn't like my ideas, I used to get angry at people. Or if they didn't understand what my ideas were, I had to yell and scream at them because why can't you understand this, right? Sometimes it's a career. You're so attached to the career that if something gets in the way, you get angry at it, right? So attachment, an inordinate love of something. This is where mafias and evil come into play, right? When you're attached to money or glory or something like that, evil things can happen. The next is frustration. Frustration is anger. What kind of frustration, causes frustration? Over obligating oneself. You're trying to do too many things, right? Difficult tasks. You try and do something and you can't do it. You didn't meet it, right? The other is, I call it the nice guy syndrome, right? You try to be this nice guy and you allow people to walk all over you and abuse you until all of a sudden you explode, right? You just explode. That's called the nice guy syndrome. The next is tired, fatigue, sickness, or medication. Tiredness and fatigue does. Sickness, medication, if you're on a medication, like I was on Zyrtec and that made me a little, crazy. And then a lack of patience, slowing down. But really, where is it coming from? When I say where is it coming from, it's really the heart of it, right? The heart of it. Am I attached to something? I get angry, and I'll give you an example. It's like, food. If I fast or something like that, I'll sometimes get angry at people. If that happens, then don't fast, okay? I learned to control my anger and everything else with the fasting, but it takes time, right? It takes time to recognize that. So recognizing where is this frustration coming from, right? Where it's the heart of the matter. Is it frustration? If it is, then what am I frustrated about? Am I over-obligating myself? Am I doing too much work? Am I always putting difficult tasks in front of me? You need to slow down, okay? Am I moving too fast? Am I trying to do too many things too quickly, okay? And so we run over people. So the first is keeping a daily examination of conscience to recognize this anger that you have and where it's coming from. The next is, where is it coming from? Then you can do a couple of things. And I call the first one kind of a negative type way of anger management or anger, and the negative way is to avoid occasion of it. Right? When I used to get the road rage, I would drive slower. Like if there was a guy that's driving at 20 miles per hour in a 40 mile per hour lane, that would drive me crazy, and I would be 2 inches away from his rear. What I started doing is just saying, okay, I'm going to give him a lot of space. Okay. And then people would honk at me thinking I was a slow one. And I was like, that's fine. And I offered it up. Okay. If you're tired or hungry, possibly on medications, then try not to interface with people. Okay. Another is walking away from the situation. There's a lot of times where I used to get into arguments with my wife and I just say, look, I can't go any further or else I'm going to get really angry. And I don't want to get that way, okay? So avoiding the occasion of sin, okay? Some positive ways of doing it is making some resolutions. Resolutions, in my eyes, 99.9% of all resolutions should be positive, okay? The first is finding good in others. If you resent someone or you resent somewhere, resent a situation or whatever it is, find the good. Okay, make a resolution to find the good. My wife used to make me angry because, I felt like we were never communicating. I always thought she was, always this bad person until I started, logically making a resolution to say, every day I'm going to find one good thing about her. And 1 became 2, 2 became 3, and everything else. Okay? A resolution to talk to them, honey, you're making me angry because of X, Y, and Z. I don't like that. Okay. Listening and mirroring. Okay. Sometimes we get frustrated because we're trying to communicate something. Okay. That, that really, did you ever hear that statement? Like, hey, we're saying the same thing. We're really saying the same thing, but we're not listening to the other person. We're trying to project our ideas on the other person rather than really listening. So there's a technique called mirroring, where you actually have to listen so that you can then repeat what that person said. You're mirroring what they said. Because a lot of times what we try to do is we try to just think of the counter arguments or project our ideas on what they're saying. And then the last thing is to make a resolution to slow down. Slow down. So I used to get frustrated because I used to buy all these books, spend all this money, and never read, a quarter of them or even 10% of them. So I just slowed down. I said, look, you know what? I'm only going to buy a new book if I finish a book. Slow down, right? Slow down in everything that you do. If you think that you can do something, do only half of it. So in other words, if you said, I think I can do 1, 2, and 3 and 4 today, then just do 2. Don't worry about doing 2, 3, 3 and 4. Slow down. Okay? If you go to monasteries or you go to friaries or convents, they move slowly. Okay? So slow down, and there's a purpose and a reason for that, right? But more importantly, and this is going to be the last topic, is that to transform that anger energy into being meek and mild, like Jesus. That's how you can take that anger and transform that into love. That's what we want to do. This is what makes, our virtue heroic, is to become meek and mild like Jesus did. He became meek and mild, and he allowed people to walk on him, beat him up, torture him, and die on the cross to show how much love. My father did the same thing to me when I was yelling and screaming at him. When I was tired or he was meek and mild. And he allowed me to beat him up to make me realize what a great man he really was and is. Okay? So we can choose either to, in a justifiable way, to say, hey, I'm going to yell at you back, or you can choose the meek and mild way. And what does that mean? It means slow down and practice the virtue of patience. Okay? Letting go and being detached to objects and ideas and actions. You will eliminate so much anger and frustration if you learn to detach. And it's, I'll do a podcast in the future of how to slowly detach. Detach from ideas, detach from, objects, detach. That's one of the things to grow in holiness, is to learn to detach from objects, including ideas. True, no strings attached, loving actions. I used to get so frustrated when I used to say, you know what, out of love, I'm going to clean the dishes. And then my wife would say, oh, those dishes are still horrible. They have food all over them, blah, blah, blah. And then I used to get angry at her and say, you know what, you don't appreciate me anymore. I did this out of love. Well, if it was truly out of love, it wouldn't matter whether she yelled at me or not for the quality of work. But I did add a string to my love, which was that I wanted her appreciation. But real no-string attached love would say, I'm going to clean these dishes, whether she likes them or not, if she yells at me or not. I'm doing it out of love. Okay? Also, learning to detach from comments when people make fun of you or something like that, or say bad things about you. Learning to detach from those comments. Okay? The next is learning to look forward. When Christ died on the cross, when he was meek and mild, he wasn't so worried about what they were saying to him. He knew he had a mission, and that was to die on that cross, because he knew the next day he was going to resurrect. It's the same thing with us. If we look forward and look that we must die on that cross for the resurrection to occur, we will then not be so angry, nor want to vent things out. If we are going to the cross and want to bring others with us, meek and mild will bring others to the cross. And they will bring them to us. Because that's the game changer in a person's life. When people get angry and the other people get angry, everyone gets angry. But when someone in that chain of anger becomes meek and mild, they will be that game stopper of anger. That's what it is. So you're choosing to be, beaten up for the love, to self-sacrifice yourself out of love so that you can convert others, that you can stop the mode of anger that goes out there. Just like love stops evil, so does meek and mildness stop anger. It will. It will bring people, right? Being childlike with no worries. Learning to laugh. When, being at peace. All right. So, and then knowing when to push and when to allow God to do his job. That's important to recognize. So, meek and mild is the game changer and is how you can transform anger into love. So, in conclusion, anger in itself is not evil, but there is even righteous anger. In most cases, it is not righteous anger, I can tell you that, but attachment, frustration, resentment, etc., that causes our anger. We need to be able to overcome anger with meekness and spiritual holiness that builds virtue and detachment and that transforms the world. So let's end it with a prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Dear Lord Jesus, help us to be meek and mild like your Son, Jesus. Help us to have the courage to do the right. We pray for all those pro-lifers this Friday who will be in D.C. as we pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. Thanks for listening to me, David Cease, at Practical Catholic. Here's a reflection for you. Take a moment to reflect, what makes me angry? Feel free to share your reflection or leave a comment on the podcast, Instagram, and Facebook at Practical Catholic, or visit my webpage at practicalcatholic1, that is the number 1.com.
You're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.